Kupferman. I'm president of Gray Panthers NYC. And as all of you know, this is an official side event at the this year's open-ended working group on aging. You all know that the issue of the UN open-ended working group on aging is to ensure the human rights of older people at the global level. This is the 13th session of the open-ended, and there's been some progress made with regard to the human rights of older people, but actually not enough. One of the things that is most relevant, one of the things that's been most relevant in the particularly recent past with regard to the human rights of older people is the death and destruction and almost the genocide or the genocide of older people due to COVID. This has exposed every single inequality and inequity around the world, and particularly with regard to older people who have been disproportionately affected. It is a tragedy that the world has not addressed the concerns of older people. And we all know about the demographic trends, but what we at Gray Panthers and others have noted is that there's a lot of talk, but not a whole lot of action. One of the things that has been most evident is the waves of death in long-term care with regard to older people who end up being even more vulnerable than the general population of older people. What we're expecting today is that we're going to spark the imagination of policymakers and practitioners and others around the world to not just write about it and talk about it, but actually do something. It's long overdue. Of course, there's money involved, but it's the human rights of older people that consistently gets ignored and put to the side. Oh, yes, these poor older people. But we're not ready to make, governments say, we're not ready to make a commitment. We've been hearing this for decades. And there's the other thing that's always said, which is, oh, yes, the demographics, it's going to be a real problem, the aging population. Well, I'm sorry, guys. It's already an issue. It's not in the future, it's today. And it's not just about the cohort of older people. It's about every single human being who will become an older person. It is not even time to plan. It's time to do. I'm going to presume that everybody on this call understands it. And let's not just talk to the echo chamber. Everybody on this call has a similar mindset. But what about all that 7 billion people that have not yet heard this message? We have the opportunity to create long-term care systems that actually make a difference, that are going to be cost effective. They ain't going to be cheap, but cost effective, and improve health outcomes, secure family relations, and ensure the economic progress of every single country and every single community if we do the long-term care systems. Of course, there's going to be problems. No matter whatever we do, there will always be problems. And we here on this call with our really great panel have the opportunity to use this as a laboratory, and we can do some experimentation, but a lot of the experimentation has already been done. It's the implementation. We want every single person on this call not only to go away with an inspiration and imagination, but to put those things into action. Can we do that? I hope we can. I just wanted to do, obviously, some introductions. As I said, I'm Jack Kupferman, president of Grey Panthers NYC. And we also have on our call, Michelle Arnaud, who is the vice president of Grey Panthers NYC. She is a fantastic implementer. She always keeps me in check. Our panel today is, aside from distinguished, they are clear doers. I'm going to do, before each presentation, I'll do a short introduction, but we're hoping that we have Peter Sherlock, Maria Isolino Dabove, Pax Matipwiri from Malawi, Dave Snedden from Colorado, and Carla Cristina Giacomin from Brazil. We are really honored that everybody will have a different perspective on how we can create new long-term care systems in light of COVID that assure the human rights of older people. Now, what we're going to be doing a little bit of different. Our first item is we want to show everybody why we're doing this. We have a short video that should give you inspiration on why the issues of long-term care, the human rights of long-term care with regard to older people are important. Emily, would you be so kind as to start the video?
Yes.
Emily is our tech guru.
Ella había sido una de las seleccionadas por este proyecto. Habíamos visto que su caso podía ser interesante e hicimos una búsqueda de las canciones que ella había bailado cuando era joven, ¿no? Y que ella había incluso sido protagonista de muchas de ellas. Por suerte teníamos escritos suyos antiguos donde ella relataba muchas de estas canciones. Al fin y al cabo, cuando el día que nosotros la pudimos conocer, pues la podíamos ver un poco triste, la podíamos ver un poco nerviosa en algunos momentos y la verdad que no sabíamos con qué eficacia iba a tener todo esto, ¿no? Pero al escuchar la canción del Lago de los Cisnes, que fue la primera que ella escuchó, la verdad que se transformó completamente y parece que parte de su mente y viajó a otro momento de su vida. La ciencia ya ha demostrado que efectivamente hay ciertas áreas relacionadas, áreas cerebrales relacionadas con la memoria musical de aquellas canciones que a cada persona le ha gustado, y estas áreas cerebrales están menos atrofiadas que otras partes del cerebro en ese tipo de enfermedades. Probablemente porque la música tiene un poder inmenso desde el principio de los tiempos, ¿no? Ya en la prehistoria se encontraban instrumentos musicales, con lo cual parece que nuestro cerebro está preparado para ser un cerebro musical. Por supuesto, la música está absolutamente unida a las emociones. Nosotros también decimos que es importante la música en la enfermedad de Alzheimer, pero más importante todavía es hacerles sentir emociones, se sientan vivos, que se sientan ese tipo de emociones. Es muy importante porque al final las emociones se asocian a momentos de nuestra vida. Tenemos vídeo de una mujer con 99 años que había sido costurera y tenía una enfermedad de Alzheimer muy avanzada, pero al escuchar las canciones de su vida, pues hacía como que cosía, iba haciendo todos los pasos de estar cosiendo con una máquina antigua. Es un vídeo muy impactante, creemos que es muy bonito. Yo quiero que la gente recuerde que las personas con Alzheimer y con otras demencias están muy vivas hasta el final de sus días. Y ya no solo las personas con Alzheimer, las personas mayores están vivas, están llenas de recuerdos, llenas de emociones y todavía pueden emocionar a todo el mundo y pueden hacernos vibrar.
Emily, thank you very much. I want everybody to understand that this video, meaning the ballerina who has the muscle memory and the beauty inside of her, despite the fact that her mind and body are not what they had been in the past, represent the human need for the human to protect the human rights of older people in every circumstance. These people clearly cannot advocate for themselves. It is our responsibility and the world's responsibility to make sure that these things, that their human rights are protected. We all just saw how much beauty there may be inside the minds of those with serious dementia. This lady, this ballerina, look how beautifully she had been expressing. Look how beautifully she had been cared for. She was immaculate in her dress and how she was being presented. That should be the standard, not frankly, the current crap that is long-term care in the world. So I hope that may be some sort of an inspiration for all of us. On that note, I'd like to start. Our first speaker, it's like we're really honored to have him with us, is Peter Lloyd Sherlock. Of course, he's like a well-acknowledged expert in social policy and international development from the University of East Anglia. He has decades of experience working with the Global South, particularly older people in poverty, and he focuses on residential care for older people in many countries, particularly in all throughout the Global South. He was recently appointed a trustee of the NGO Age International, and he has been doing a lot of work and focuses his career, or much of his career, on the human rights of older people in residential and long-term care in order to help countries develop their long-term care systems. Peter, would you be so kind as to start?
Certainly, and thank you so much, Jack, for inviting me to speak with the Grey Panthers and with all of these other people from around the world. As you said, we're mainly focusing today on what we might call the Global South. To be honest, I could spend the whole time talking to you about human rights in care homes in my own country, in the United Kingdom. Here, our early pandemic response was to discharge infected older people from hospitals directly into care homes, without testing, without providing PPE for staff, without offering support for these care homes. I could talk about the measures these care homes started to adopt at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of them were vital, some questionable, and very few took into account the rights of their residents. But instead, my task here today is to talk about care homes, long-term care facilities in the Global South. And I've been involved in a number of studies over the last 10 or 15 years. And they show across quite a range of countries that the numbers of long-term care facilities across countries in Latin America, most of Asia, and even parts of Africa are already very large and are growing extremely quickly, much more quickly than in richer countries. But despite that, there's very little acknowledgement of their existence, very little monitoring or regulation by state agencies. Often, not always, but often these care homes have much fewer resources than in countries like the USA or the UK. Large shared dormitory rooms are the norm, not the exception. Often These facilities have very few trained staff and very limited facilities. And of course, this scenario may well be a fertile terrain for the widespread abuse of older people. But there's almost no evidence of what goes on behind their closed doors, other than occasional media exposés. Many care homes are not even registered with official agencies. For those that are, robust, unannounced checks and inspections just about unheard of. Regulation mainly involves checking the number of fire escapes, rather than checking whether residents feel their lives are worth living. I found that the only way to get some reliable view of what was going on inside these care homes was to recruit and work with older women living in the same neighborhoods where those care homes were based, operating as clandestine researchers. And I did this in one city in Argentina with a number of academic and non-academic colleagues there. These undercover researchers visited care homes posing as relatives of a fictional older person who might be admitted. Some of the things they revealed were truly shocking to me. Here are just two examples. In none of the 30 care homes in our study was the consent of the older person to be admitted seen as necessary. In only one case did a director suggest meeting the older person before admission, and that was, in their own words, to see if they were a troublemaker. There was no specific information that we shared that our fictional relative had specific problems with cognition or other conditions that might mean they could not necessarily act in their own best interests. The concept of power of attorney might as well have been from Mars. One other quick example. Almost all these care homes insisted that older people use incontinence pads, even if they were capable of going to the toilet with small amounts of help. From the care home's point of view, pads meant fewer demands on staff and more control. This is one very small example of a much wider ethos of control and disempowerment that we found was very common across these facilities. We shared these findings with colleagues from Latin America and other regions, and they told us the situation where they lived was just about the same. I'd begun this particular study mainly interested in the quality of care, but the findings forced me to change my language and perspective to a more radical one of abuse of human rights, deprivations of liberties and basic freedoms of hundreds and thousands of older people. Perhaps not state sanctioned, but certainly permitted by state agencies that are reluctant to grapple with what Al Gore calls an inconvenient truth, and permitted by societies, including my own, that are vaguely aware of the situation, but who give it no real thought. I'd like to share a quotation from one of the most seminal works on human rights. An archipelago of closed spaces embedded within another country, floating over its streets. Despite this, those who were not part of it did not notice its presence. And although quite a few had a vague notion of it, only those who had lived there knew it well. But as if they had lost their speech on the islands of the archipelago, they remained silent. That's from the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Please let me clarify. There are some important oases of good practice in long-term care facilities in the global south. There are exceptions, which are very admirable. And I'm not saying, just like Jack, that we need to get rid of all these long-term care facilities and close them down. There is clearly a need for them as part of wider systems of care services and support, and that need will continue to grow. And I certainly do not want to suggest that many of the people who run or work in these facilities can even be remotely compared to the guards of the Gulag. Many of them are trying their best and care deeply about their residents. Many are just trying to make a living, doing a very difficult job, which I wouldn't be able to do. But a lack of resources and pretty much a total absence of state support and guidance makes this an impossible task. So for me, the main responsibility for this archipelago of abuse doesn't lie with those people. It lies with the state's dereliction of responsibility and with wider society's preference to avert their eyes. When the pandemic began to hit care homes in rich countries, I feared the effects would be even worse in the global south. Close colleagues, including Carla, who's on today's panel, felt the same. Carla will tell you about an amazing social movement she established and led to protect Brazil's care homes from the worst effects of the pandemic. I wish I could tell you about similar examples in other countries in Asia, Latin America, or Africa, but there are none. I developed some projects partnering with local governments to develop emergency COVID strategies. One starting point was to try to get hold of reliable lists of all care homes operating in their territories. In none of the countries or cities where I worked did such lists exist at the start of the pandemic. Another starting point was for local agencies, especially health and social services, to work together. In the past, both theoretically had some responsibility for care homes, but they operated separately, mainly on the basis of passing the buck between each other. In most of the places I worked with over the pandemic, some progress was made in establishing more comprehensive lists of care homes, especially when vaccines became available, since this created an incentive for these care homes to get in touch with public health agencies. This could have provided a basis for more effective regulation and interagency cooperation once the immediate pandemic crisis had passed. Also, the pandemic had, to some extent, brought care homes into the public gaze for the first time in many of these countries. This held out a tantalizing prospect of more concerted and well-resourced public policies to regulate, but also to support care homes so that they could provide acceptable levels of care based on principles of respect and dignity and human rights. Tragically, this hasn't really happened in any of the countries I work in. As with the other building back dreams that we all had towards the end of 2021, these opportunities rapidly evaporated and we seem to have returned to business as usual. And in the case of most care homes, it is a business, a big, and in some cases, very lucrative business, and one that is almost entirely unregulated. As an academic, I'd like to give you reliable evidence about what this means for the human rights of those older people who find themselves, and this is almost never a decision they themselves make, who find themselves in these facilities. We have this kind of evidence for prison populations in most countries, but we do not for older people in most care homes in the global south. What goes on there is behind closed doors. Thank you.
Peter, a sobering look. It also kind of talks to what the call to action may be. I'd like to hear, what is your call to action?
Can we maybe discuss that towards the end of the panel?
Because
I don't want to just come up with a quick soundbite response to that. It's such an important question. And
yes.
I think it's also something that perhaps would be a shared question across all the panelists and other people in the room.
Fabulous. I
Yeah.
also
But I guess the call is to the state. I think the call needs to be made to governments. That's all I would say now.
And governments, not just to governments, but to actually do something of value, not just talk about it. So, and we're going to be moving forward, but one of the things that you were referencing that is important that we need to understand is that at the core of a lot of this is ageism, the invisibility of older people. And yes, of course, there's going to be the inevitable deterioration, but does anybody really care? I'm not so sure. Let's see what happens. And we here have the opportunity to move this forward. I'd like to also move on to our next speaker, who's Maria Isolina Dabove. She represents INPEA in Argentina. I'm sorry, she represents INPEA, International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse in Argentina, and has been working with the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. She's done much of her career with regard to human rights, particularly with regard to older people. She's authored a number of books concerning the rights of older people, in elder law as an interdisciplinary perspective, and access to justice. She had been a member of the Organization of American States in Argentina's official delegation for the development of the Regional Inter-American Convention on the Rights of Older People, which has been a successfully implemented document and declaration for Latin America. Brava! Now, she is a researcher at the law school of the Buenos Aires University. She's a professor of and lecturer in the philosophy of law and elder law in Argentina and other Latin American countries, as well as in the rest of the world. She has a beautiful demeanor, a great speaker, and we're really lucky that she's going to be part of our panel today, because much of what we're talking about is what she's been focusing on recently. Isolina, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Many thanks to you for many thanks you for coming to this presentation, and I would also like to thank Jack in particular for inviting me to join this panel. Well, nowadays, long-term care services are socially accepted alternatives which meet which meet the need for assistance and accommodation for older persons, particularly if they are in dependent situations. They include a wide array of services, such as personal care, social services, medical and mental health assistance, nursing, therapy, recreation, and cultural activities, among others. However, as we well know, COVID has pushed us to become aware of the social inequities and the risks and painful experienced by older persons in these facilities. They have been more directly exposed to disease and death than any other age group. So, what lessons had the pandemic taught us? How can prevent that all the human rights that have been violated in long-term care institutions will not be violated again, in particular in Argentina, my country? Today, I am going to talk to you about how we can do this. My presentation will be divided in 3 parts. Firstly, I am going to look at the current legal situation of human rights of older persons and their rights in long-term care facilities in Argentina. Secondly, I will tell you what long-term care facilities in this country have got through during the pandemic. Finally, I will give you some reasons to support the need for an international convention of human rights of older persons, which takes into account the complex issue of long-term facilities. Let's see the first point. From the legal point of view, long-term care facilities are very complex institutions due to the multi-legal regulation whose services are from the public and the private law. But for a long time, these services have been described from a predominant medical perspective. In the historical Occidental evolution of these services, 2 moments stand out. The first is based on the development of precursor institutions, such as the medieval retirement contract with abbeys and convents, the hospices or almhouses of the English poor law of modernity and the hospital homes of charities which proliferated in the 19th century liberal state. The second is linked to the emergence of geriatric nursing, based on a medical point of view of aging, and to the gerontological nursing of the welfare state since 1970. This focused on health and wellness, in addition to illness, and unfortunately, this approach is still maintained against the current human rights standards. Before the last pandemic, in 2015, the Inter-American Human Rights Systems approved the Inter-American Convention on the Protection of Human Rights of Older Persons, which has introduced a significant change in the way these services are defined due to the evolution of gerontology, among other standards linked to fight discrimination and ageism. The Convention sets new protected rights regarding older persons' care. Particularly important are the rights to life and dignity, to safety, and to a life free of violence of any kind, to health, to give free and informed consent on health matters, and finally, the right to a comprehensive system of long-term care. Article 12 requires states to guarantee health, social services coverage, autonomy, integrity, and gender perspective to older persons and assistance measures for family and caregivers. Furthermore, Article 12 sets specific tasks to fulfill those aims, such as ensuring that the beginning and conclusion of long-term care services are decided on by the older person's free and express will, assessing and supervising the facilities, legislating on the liability of personnel and long-term caregivers, and guaranteeing palliative care. Finally, it's important to point out that the Inter-American Convention mirrors the standards set by the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 30 quotes the content of Article 12 of the CRPD, which introduced a Copernican revolution as far as the concept of autonomy and legal capacity. Argentina ratified this treaty in 2017, and nowadays it has constitutional hierarchy. But what did it happen in long-term care facilities in Argentina during the pandemic? Argentina has a fast process of aging population, with almost 17% of persons aged 60 and over. Buenos Aires City is the third aged capital town in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Here, the long-term care facilities flourished in the 19th century as charities to take care of the poor elderly. From the 1940 through the 1990s, a mix of public and private entities provided social services such as accommodation, meals, and medical assistance according to a geriatric point of view. These policies gave rise to the current gerontological services, which can be long-stay facilities or day centers. In either case, the elderly in those institutions have always been considered sick, passive subjects, and productive beings, or a social cost. Today, Argentina has approximately 3,800 public and private long-term care institutions, which are used by 1.3% of the total elderly population. They are few. The COVID-19 touched mainly the poorest neighborhoods of the country, as poverty appears to be a crucial risk factor that increased the contamination. However, it also affected poor and wealthy long-term care institutions at the same extent. Let's remember that older persons were the population at risk, and the institution's staff overworked all the time. Many of the workers had multi-jobs, and they didn't take care of older persons there as well as they should do. So the National Ministry of Health activated protocols and preventive procedures for direct care to those residents. Besides, the national and the local directions of policies for older persons implemented interdisciplinary and intersectoral actions to promote, protect, and guarantee the fundamental rights of older persons, especially if they were poor or if they were alone. Also, regular controls and visits were made by government representatives to see how this institution functioned, and they provided necessary supplies and resources for safety and security. Besides, there were many judicial procedures with great success to guarantee all these questions. According to PAHO, 130,000 millions of persons died in total due to COVID in Argentina. It represented the 0.25% of the general average mortality. Over this total, almost 30% were older persons who died in living long-term residences. The most important factors that generated these situations were poverty, isolation, difficulties in implementing adequate care systems due to the accumulated fatigue of the staff. Another important element was the paternalism used in the design of some public policies. At that time, this type of policy denied, in particular, older people, older persons, the right to decide for themselves about their life and care in a responsible way. So, the COVID-19 gave us the real opportunity to implement lessons learned. For me, the first one is the recognition of the need to properly incorporate respect of human rights of older persons in both residential and family caregiving, such as the Inter-American system did. And it is necessary to transform the old system into one that guarantees quality and respect in care worldwide. Furthermore, because the elderly population is growing faster, it's important to promote the development of this type of care services in all regions of the world, rich and poor, without any kind of discrimination. It is necessary to fight the current culture, ageist culture, and the elder abuse with all the legal tools we have. And it's important to develop educational training programs about long-term care services with an aging and human rights perspective. In Argentina, there are few staff well-trained, and they have low salaries. Besides, we need a judicial power that can solve these kind of conflicts quickly and with strong legal basis, such as the human rights treaties give us. So, the United Nations, together with the civil society and experts, should work quickly and democratically in the writing of the first draft of this international convention. A convention, an international one, will mean international, official, and legal recognition that life and the dignity of life is valued throughout the lifespan, from birth until death, in equal conditions. It will empower older persons, promotes their social value, their inclusion, and make sustainable the construction of a society for all ages, because it would recognize their human rights and fundamental freedoms formally worldwide. It will impose duties to states party to safeguard these human rights. They could adopt measures to prevent, punish, and eradicate practices that affect the safety and integrity of older persons. They could develop affirmative actions and make reasonable adjustments in the legislative, administrative, judicial, and economic level for the effective exercise of these rights. They could promote international cooperation with more efficient tools than now, and they could encourage a broad participation of civil society, institutions, and older persons in the drafting, implementation, and oversight of public policies and laws about it. Finally, this convention could give older persons themselves, civil society or institutions, the possibility to submit reports and complaints of any violations of the provisions contained in it. After the clear evidence of age discrimination due to COVID-19, this convention must be drafted now, as soon as possible, giving an important recognition to the rights of older persons having facility. Many thanks for your attention.
You know, Iselina, your passionate, analytic, important discussion needs to be heard by many. And yet we still have a number of other panelists that have important comments for all of us. Very grateful for what you've been doing. And, you know, we do need to listen to what you were talking about in terms of using the convention as the opportunity to protect the human rights of older people in long-term care. Now, we're really excited to have an opportunity to have Pax Matiwiri, I always have a problem with that name, from Malawi. He represents what's happening in developing countries as they are developing their long-term care systems. That has never really been focused on. That's part of what we're here today to do. And there is innovation, there is development. It's really slow. Peter talks about basically that there's almost nothing. There is almost nothing, but Pax's situation shows that there is creativity involved. Pax is the founder of the Life Care Malawi Foundation. Let's see, he had been trained in the United States at Oregon State University, and then following his education went back to Malawi to focus on the care of not just older people, but children, people with disabilities, and particularly focus on home care, as well as addressing disasters. And of course, there's been recently weather-related terrible conditions in Malawi that also need to be addressed. The Life Care College that he founded is the first and only recognized training institution in Malawi offering in-home healthcare management certificate for caregivers, basically home health aides in Malawi. Of course, the entire health system is much different there than here, but let's look at this as the opportunity or an inspiration. He's had 17 years of work. He's a former director of one of the hospitals in Malawi and has been a grant scholar at Rotary International. And it's a real honor to have him working with us. He also represents the fact that we're not talking to the echo chamber here. He is somebody new that has not always been part of this conversation. Pax, would you be so kind as to offer your comments? Are you there? Pax? Is he there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now, just please start
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Jack. Today I'm going to present Malawi in regards to long-term care for older people, especially in Malawi. However, about talking about human rights of older persons in long-term care facilities in Malawi, we have the policies, legal framework that has been put in place in the Constitution of Malawi, and especially like the Section 13 J of the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi provides the government that the government shall respect and support the elderly through the provision of community services and encourage their participation in the life of community. And also in the section 20 of the Constitution provides that discrimination of persons in any form is prohibited, and all persons are under any law that guarantees equal and effective protection against discrimination on grounds of race, color, sex, religion, and political. The government of Malawi has a policy, a national policy on equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities, and that was adopted in 2006, and the national policy of older persons, which was adopted in 2016. These policies were meant to guide the government and relevant stakeholders in upcoming with programs that will respond to the needs of the elderly. However, in terms of practice on the ground, generally discrimination of older persons is based on perception, where witchcraft is linked to older persons. In this regard, violence is perpetuated, leading to loss of property, economic activities, and even life itself. Malawi government has also carried out a study in 2016, which was titled Realizing Income Security in Old Age, and the study into the feasibility of universal old age pension in Malawi. But this study indicated that older persons, both men and women, are experiencing a lot of challenges in their life in Malawi. And these challenges include discrimination, abuse, attacks, killings, accusation of practicing witchcraft, health issues, neglect, and financial mismanagement. Older persons in Malawi have difficulties in exercising of their legal capacity in their social life and financial independence. And most of them with good financial resources are often really rely on their children and grandchildren in managing these financial resources on their behalf without their consent. And access to justice is problematic because most older persons, including those with disabilities, are not aware of the legal process. Most of the times, although Malawi has different social services, these services are not easily accessible to older persons and even those people with disabilities because of long distance, attitudes of service providers, and lack of affordability in terms of. However, many older persons live with their children and grandchildren in extended family system where they get family support for their survival in communities.
Pax, can you talk about the home care certification as an example of innovation in Malawi?
Yeah, so in this case, since we established Life Care Malawi Foundation in 2015, we came with a plan to at least address some of the issues that affects older persons. And the Life Care Malawi Foundation a training program that is training the caregivers, and Malawi government through Tiveta Authority registered Life Care College and Health Sciences to train people within the community and across the country, at least to learn about how to take care of older people, children, people with disabilities, and patients at home.
If I understand correctly, you recently had your first graduating class. Is that correct?
Not yet. It is happening next week. It's on 16th.
How many people will be graduating?
120 caregivers are going to be graduating.
Can you also tell us what the unique aspect of your of this training program is that would be useful for other similar countries that are developing long-term care systems? And does Malawi have a long-term care policy, however it may be? First of all, does Malawi have a long-term care policy?
No.
And what is unique about what you are doing with regard to the training of home care workers for older and other kinds of disabled populations? What's unique? What aspects of that?
In fact, here in Malawi, we don't have the institutions that is accommodating the older persons. And Malawi, like the colleges and the universities, they are not even offering any type of course that is focusing on caring for people living in their homes who are sick, and also maybe the older persons. So Life Care is the only college which is training these caregivers to understand and remove the perception that each and every old person is a witch or is practicing witchcraft.
Can you also tell us, when people on this call do not understand, or many of them have never even been exposed to the concept of older people as witches? Can you just tell us a little bit about what that means and how that is so detrimental?
In fact, we understand that most of the older people, they may develop some other healthy conditions, such as dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, most of these conditions here in Malawi, they are not regarded as health conditions that are associated with old age. So here in Malawi, a lot of people, they think different, especially those people living in the rural areas. Many people, when they develop this dementia or Parkinson's disease, they think they are practicing witchcraft because they kind of like behave in different way.
And that,
whereby,
and then that leads to discrimination and people
yes,
excluding the older people just for their natural conditions, which means that
yes,
it's even more complicated to provide care so that these people can live whatever kind of a decent life that they might be able to.
yes, they are even beaten or even killed and burned alive.
This is a horrible thing, but I think we're going to have to move forward, Pax, with
Yes,
others, because what you're talking about is so important and enlightening, but we have a lot more to cover today.
thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Dave Snedden. He has a number of specific ideas that may be able to be of assistance in unique ways to address long-term care, not only in the US, but elsewhere. You know, he worked in tech startups, hotel management, and with great fun, punk bands. He's been a nursing home administrator who has a great personal hands-on style, and he has overseen hundreds of care facilities across the US. He is currently located in Colorado. He's been the COO, the Chief Operating Officer and CEO of a long-term nonprofit that provides support for people with intellectual disabilities in a variety of forums. Aside from his educational background, he is engaging and has a lot of important and innovative suggestions for us. Dave, would you be so kind?
Thank you, Jack. And I'll see what I can cut down a little bit here. I am an industry person, and I am based in the United States, so I know that's not probably the same perspective as a lot of folks. Last week, I was asked in an icebreaker to describe the current state of the senior care industry in America using song lyrics. And the ones I picked were, "I've got an aching in my heart and arson on my mind. I'm going to burn your playhouse down." I think, you know, COVID exposed a lot of the flaws that we all know are in the current system in the US. But is it time to burn it down and do something very, very different? All the solutions that I'm seeing out there right now seem to center around three things: staffing, funding, and regulation. And I've seen some of the folks in the comments agree with some of that. But I think that all of those can make the current system tenable, but they don't address whether or not the current model is the right one, or even if there is a right one. You know, we know the staffing problem. We've lost 229,000 caregivers in the US since the beginning of COVID. 86% of nursing homes are running a staff shortage right now. And the projections show that we're going to need as many as 8.2 million more people in the next 5 years to come into the field. I don't think there's any amount of training, immigration reform, or funding that's going to fix that. By most estimates, half of the nursing homes in the US are operating at a loss, and 400 have closed since the beginning of the pandemic. When we get to regulatory solutions, most of them seem to be punitive, whether it's increasing funding for enforcement, even though the NIH study last year on COVID deaths in nursing homes showed that the quality rating from CMS had no bearing on death rate. Good homes, bad homes, 1 star to 5 star, they had the same rate. So regression analysis showed an R-squared of 0.21 between those. For the non-statisticians in the room, that means that CMS star rating had the same predictive power of COVID death rates as the eye color of the maintenance guy. None at all. There are good actors, there are bad actors, but that is not what was driving it. It is a structural issue. And that's certainly the main thing I want to talk about. There's also been proposals to, you know, increase staffing requirements to 4.1. I'm not going to get into all the detail on why I think that's absurd, but it ignores the individual patient needs. Some people will need much more than that. Some will need much less. We already saw a friend of mine who works in the NHS in Britain has told me all about how the minimums there drove people to a lower standard and impacted quality outcomes poorly. In the model that we have of nursing homes now in the United States, the large congregate model, nobody saw one COVID case. Once COVID was there, it ran through that population. And of course it did. If you've got 100 people who are living, sleeping, and eating in close proximity, sharing bathrooms, sharing rooms, some of the large dorm styles that we've heard about in other areas, containment was impossible, regardless of how well you did it and how well you managed quality and infection control. Colleagues of mine shared devastating stories again and again. I spoke to so many people in tears about this. I still maintain a list of all of the people that the organization I worked for lost to COVID, from Preston to Mary. I'll remember all of their names. But the most successful models of nursing homes through COVID were actually models like greenhouse, small home, household models. All of those emphasize smaller cohorts and a physical plant that's different, with private rooms, private bathrooms, and they tend to have significantly lower staff turnover. Staff who know the elders are going to have a much earlier identification of a change of condition than a new staff member that's sent in every other day by an agency. Greenhouse homes saw rates that were less than a third of that in traditional nursing homes. If you're interested in that, I had a lot more to say about that, but I want to get to my main thing, Jack. If you're interested about that, then there's a great article in Health Affairs this week by Charlie Sabatino, who's a great guy. Through all of the discussion of what
just so you know, people on this call, many people on this call will know Charlie Sabatino.
Great. And he covers it much better than I was going to, so go read that. But I want to talk about some non-traditional models outside of those congregate living settings, because through all of the discussion of what the problems are, we've lost sight of who we're solving them for. And that's the people who are in care. What do they need? What do they want? And that answer is going to be as individual as the people that we care for. The amount of nursing care, social work support, therapy needed, psychosocial needs, even the type of environment is going to vary. If you don't want, need, or like the same things as everyone else when you're 40, why are you going to like, need, and want the same things when you're 80? Some people may love the current nursing home model. It might work for some people. It's a great sense of community, but I got to tell you, if I'm 80 years old and someone hands me a bingo card while we're listening to all these pop songs that I didn't like when they were brand new, what they write in my chart about my behaviors is going to be spectacular. So instead of forcing everyone who's into a model that was really built around physical structures that were designed for the understanding we had of people's care needs in the 1960s, what are alternatives? The one I really want to get to is a model that's used in some states in the US, not for senior care, but actually for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I believe it can be adapted both in the US and in other countries. The host home model is essentially an adult foster care system, to really simplify it. An agency that has expertise in care for the population will find and train people to care for adults with IDD who come and live in their home with them. Now, the key components of that model are finding a good match for placement, quality oversight and training, and then support services like therapy, behavior support on call. I oversaw a few hundred of those types of placements during COVID, as well as hundreds of locations that had a more traditional congregate living arrangement. People with IDD had a 16% mortality rate nationally. Our homes, it was about 1.2%, so significantly less. But even at that low rate, the people in the host home were a quarter of the rate of COVID deaths that we saw per person in the congregate living settings. And of course they were. There's less opportunities for exposure, and you're not just talking about having consistent staffing, you're talking about being part of a family. Host homes generally have 1 to 2 patients who live together with a family rather than a new caregiver that's sent every 8 hours by a staffing agency. Of course they did better. It costs less per day, and it solves a lot of those major staffing issues that I talked about earlier. I'll give you one example. We had 9 people who lived in a group home in Colorado. They were cared for by 26 direct care staff covering all those shifts. We closed those homes, and those 9 people moved into host homes with families, and they became half of the caseload for one IDD professional. Absolutely amazing. But for me, the real aha moment came when I visited one nursing home, one host home placement, and I met a lady with IDD who I'd actually known 9 years earlier, who lived in one of my nursing homes. She was in her 70s on hospice, but I'd never seen her so happy and so full of life. She lived with 2 sisters in their home. They had training and support from our agency, but they were the primary caregivers for this person that they'd welcomed into their family. They also cared for a younger non-verbal quadriplegic gentleman with IDD. Now, he might have been non-verbal, but he was very communicative through gestures and his iPad. They'd just gone on a 6-week road trip with him across the Western United States. He let me know with an absolutely massive grin, his favorite parts of the trip had been meeting girls on the beach in Southern California. He's never going to have that experience in a nursing home playing bingo. Host homes are by no means the only solution, any more than alternate nursing home settings like Greenhouse are. They're going to work for individual people, but when we focus on the individual needs, rather than trying to figure out a new way to more efficiently utilize current physical buildings, then we're going to be able to create better care models. My big call to action, Jack, is going to be, instead of finding ways to maximize profit from real estate that was built for care needs as we perceived them 60 years ago, I would advocate that we should spend that money on educating and providing resources for people in the communities to care for the elderly in that community, rather than replicating the mistakes of an American system that focused on efficiency and cost effectiveness. And ultimately, it's delivered neither. Not only is the care and the quality outcomes, not only are they going to be better, but I would also advocate that communities are better when we include people of all ages and all abilities.
God bless you. And you know, I enjoy your presentations. You are engaging and funny. So like and you're
funny looking.
Well, that too. But what is also great is that, you know, you have provided us with a little bit of innovation. And what I'm hoping that through this presentation, through this webinar, that people around the world will spark their imaginations as to how things can be different and effective and assure the human rights of older people in long-term care and in residential facilities, however that may be defined. So Dave, thank you very much. What I'd like to do, just so everybody knows, we're going to be having a survey as we move forward. Our important discussant now is Carla Cristina Giacomin. She is a geriatrician in Brazil who works with Peter Sherlock on a number of issues, and she has a great perception of what's going on in Brazil and the limitations of long-term care in middle-income countries. She works in Belo Horizonte. I never know how to say that properly. And in the healthcare system, as I said, she's a geriatrician. She has a degree in mental health, and she represents research on a practical level. What needs to be done? What needs to be cataloged? How her work is about how do we jumpstart the quality of care and the quality of life for older people, not only in Brazil, but elsewhere, and why it's been so ignored for so long. She defends the rights of older people by, of course, dealing with items in Brazil, and her consultants work with the WHO and the International Longevity Center. She's researched and she's the bomb. Carla, would you be so kind as to take it away and give us your insights?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I would like to answer your questions. So Brazil has around 32 million people over age 60, which represent 13% of the overall population of our country. Maybe less than 1% lives in care homes in Brazil. As you know, our country is a huge and an unequal country. And we say maybe less than 1% because we really don't know how many, where, why, how much, or how they are being cared in long-term care. In Brazil, as in other low and middle income countries, long-term care is mostly provided informally, typically by family and friends. Even for the most vulnerable and functionally impaired older adults, despite the growth of private long-term care services in our country. Our policies are ageist, sexist, feminist. So when a family institutionalizes someone, it can suffer prejudices. So when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, news about the high COVID-19 mortality rates among European long-term care facility patients and the emergence of the first SARS-CoV-2 infection cases in Brazil led gerontologists to publish a manifesto called The Cry of the Long-Term Care Facilities, COVID-19 and Homes for the Aged, Care or an Announced Death. Knowing the reality of Brazilian long-term cares, we feared that if the pandemic were to arrive here with the same strength, it would reach unprepared facilities from the point of view of care, physical space, workforce, and resources in general. Therefore, we imagined that it would be a catastrophe. So we were very concerned about all of those issues. On April 80th, 2020, several older adult human rights groups organized an online group for text, audio, and video communication about how to quickly take action against the social and health threats to Brazilian long-term care facilities during the pandemic. As a result, the National Front for Strengthening Long-Term Care Facility was established. The pandemic arrived here, and to give you an idea, when the National Front was created, Brazil had 122 deaths from COVID. We are talking now over 700,000 deaths. We are sure that National Front has helped to halt the spread of COVID-19 because we rapidly advocated specific measures. We urged a ban on visits and informed people on how to avoid contagion from the virus. Unfortunately, during COVID times, the scenario proved to be even more critical for people residing in long-term care facilities here in Brazil. In Brazil, these institutions can be public or private, with the particularity of functioning as a residence for people aged 60 or over, regardless of whether they have family support or not, and are a social assistance equipment. More difficult, due to politicization, the situation severity was not immediately perceived in Brazil, due to the government's lack of response to the pandemic. Initiatives by non-governmental social and labor organizations such as ours helped healthcare facilities cope with these new challenges by providing robust scientific evidence, information bulletins, protocols for training sessions, reports, etc. So the National Front was a pioneer in the way it acted, how it related to different people and its access to people. Long-term care felt very supported because when an outbreak happened, they called us, and they called to say, look, I found out that there is a person with a fever. What can I do? And we also found their were long-term cares giving care to old people which were not yet known or registered with government agencies. For example, the access to diagnostic tests for residents and workers was extremely limited. All institutions had difficulty in accessing personal protective equipment, barriers and containment measures, and guidance on their proper use. We were producing manuals responding to new demands as they appeared. Questions like this appeared: how can I take care of nutrition? And so we worked on nutrition, did a manual or a specific online lecture or live session about nutrition. How do I do oral hygiene in a person with Alzheimer's disease? That's doubts were there before COVID, but now they could ask someone. And so we joined dentists, nurses, doctors, and we made an oral hygiene manual. We had to do several webinars considering we couldn't catch everyone in the Northeast or the entire Southeast, for example, in just one day. We did buy 250 live sessions, and today we already reached more than 750,000 views of our material. We already have more than 1,400 volunteer health professionals registered with the National Front. And we see a mortality rate in Brazilian long-term care facility that was lower in most countries. And we attribute this in part, of course, not all, to our ability to generate reliable information. When you ask us what are human rights for older persons in long-term care facility, or they should have respected their privacy, intimacy, beliefs, religion, sexuality, financial resources, feelings, and care at the end of life, including palliative care. Despite some controversial criticism on defining it, we think dignity in care is a core concept that must be guaranteed to any human being, wherever their condition is. And we try to recognize that we reach dignity when we develop a person-centered integrated care. Is it a dream? Maybe. Usually, the voices of older persons are not included to define long-term care, but in our movement, they were included, since all of our work was completely person-centered, and during webinars, when they could talk about loneliness, fear, feelings, they were there. We stimulate them to organize some kinds of celebrations during pandemics inside long-term care facility to face with loneliness and invisibility. If you ask us for giving you some specific examples of good practice and bad practice to assure human rights for older persons in residential long-term care facility, we can talk rigid or inflexible technical and organizational routines, depersonalized care in long-term care homes, depriving residents of expressing their opinions and desires. Due to time constraints, resources, and caregivers' propensity for task-oriented care, the depersonalization of care often compromises the resident's dignity, who is forced to obey meal times, hygiene standards and continence, participation in social activities, and sometimes even control over one's belongings. Even when residents have their cognition and desire for autonomy preserved, a tension may emerge when organizations decide to maintain a risk-free environment by forcing staff and residents to obey rules that limit autonomy and control. There's a huge issue about dignity and human rights in long-term care facility, but dignity in long-term care facility must always be linked to values of personhood and unique identity and disaggregated from the use of any form of physical or chemical restraints. The zero tolerance culture of abuse or restraints against the older residents must be an organization dogma understood and practiced by all staff, including volunteers. So what lessons must be learned for developed and developing nations with regard to residential long-term care? What drives all of us in this room is the desire to transform care for older people in each country to bring long-term care facilities onto the radar of public policies. In my country, people who live in long-term care facilities are completely invisible since they are not even properly noticed by social assistance departments, which are legally responsible for them, nor by health system. Therefore, I think we need to improve a lot of things. Rules that regulate long-term care, public funding. Today, each person institutionalized in Brazil receives less than $50 a month by government. Access to information, care management, business management, since our long-term care facilities are very unprofessional in the way they work. And I am sure that all of us need to and will continue to operate because of our work is far from over. I would like to share with you some experience, but we have no time. Our proposal is to continue advocating for our country to join the International Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, aiming to eliminate all forms of discrimination, among others, age discrimination. This could be reached by creating partnerships with other organizations as Grey Panthers, International Longevity Centers, Help Age International, and others. We are advocating for a national care policy to respond to the lack of a care policy directed to old people in Brazil. Long-term care facilities are the point of an iceberg for a struggling long-term care system. And if a person is unable to access the tip of the iceberg, it means that they have access to nothing. Thank you.
God bless you, Carla. And one of the things that I've noted from all of these presentations is that we don't have just the thinkers and the talkers, we have the doers. Everybody on this call, every presentation, and everybody who's been a participant is a doer. How do we make sure that what we're talking about and what we're doing has long-term effect? We've discussed many powerful issues, whether it's about witchcraft or the situation in Brazil, or whatever it may be, the unique innovative solutions for some aspects of long-term care, understanding of what needs to be done in Brazil, as well as in the global South and Argentina. Human rights for older people in long-term care is rarely discussed. I think that we have been here blessed to have that opportunity to expand on it. What we will be doing is that we will be sending out, amongst other things, a survey to everybody who's been on this call. And we're going to also be sending out the link to this discussion and resources. Also want to note that Global Aging has done a similar report that recently came out on the issue of human rights and long-term care. So we will be sending that out as well. But I'd like to ask people, because we've been going on for so long, who has questions? And if so, please do them now. And we understand that not everybody will be able to stay on as long as they might like to. Who has a question? I know that there's a lot of brain power here and a lot of thought going on. But perhaps not. Perhaps not. that's a little of a
Jack, I'm always happy to chip in with something. My only question is, you know, this is a meeting organized at least by the Grey Panthers, and your question was about, you know, what the call to action might be, and my sense is that, well, you know, there are so many things that need to be done, but certain organizations perhaps can play a different role in addressing these many problems. And my sense is that a civil society organization with a tradition of radicalism and not, you know, sort of being an insider group and towing the line, like the Grey Panthers, can play a very specific role. And think about organizations like ACT UP during, you know, the years of the worst years of HIV/AIDS, representing the rights of people with different sexualities, the way they campaigned. Now, I think what you need to do is actually possibly be much less like an academic like myself. I think you need to grab public attention about, you know, the absolute horrors that result from the failure of state agencies to respond to these issues, not to demonize the care homes and people who work there, because believe me, they are almost as much victims in many ways, apart from the people who make a lot of money out of this, and a few do, not many. So it's not to pass the buck on to them, which is often what government agencies like to do. It's to say, this is happening on your watch. It's to challenge that vagueness that I use the quotation to discuss, where society would rather avert its eyes.
Now, one of the,
I think surely that's what you guys are great at doing. You
know, this has been what you're specifically talking about has been one of my dreams, to make long-term care, particularly with regard to nursing homes, through rile up the public as an ACT UP, in an ACT UP style. One of the people who's already on this call that knows how to rile up the world is Alex Kalache. When you listen to Alex, he always has, you are always feeling inspired and always feeling like you know that there's something important that needs to be done. Now, I also wanted to say, like Melody, it has a call to action. You know, it's in the chat. We have other people talking about calls to action. We will be, as I said, we will be sending out a survey and soon. And Alex, can you please chime in?
Thank you so much. Sorry, one thing just about the survey. When we close the meeting, everyone will get the survey. So please respond to it then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jack, for your kind words. And I think that more than ever, the pandemic has shown how desperately bad we are in terms of protecting the most vulnerable. What has happened in countries like Spain, France, or England, and Italy, in Canada, has just been replicated in the developing world. If there was no excuse for us, it is dismal that we are still having this situation in developed countries that should know better. But Jack, if there is one thing that we need to do, and that we should put much more emphasis, is in fact what Carla, in an amazing way, has done in Brazil, which is to call voluntary work from experts around the country, to have the leadership to command 1,200 people with different expertise, so that they could fulfill what was the obligation of the state. But unfortunately, Bolsonaro's government couldn't care less. He oversaw the death of 700,000 people. We only have 3% of the total population in the world, but we are responsible for over 11%. I think that the two things that it shows is first, attitude, second, determination to protect the lives, and we can only do that if you have a rights-based approach. Adding to that, I don't think that health professionals in general have been trained to deal with older people in general, let alone when faced with a dramatic situation. So I think that the international convention that we desperately need, and it's more than time. I'm fed up, to tell you the truth, Jack.
You ain't the only one. We've been doing this for years and there's been no movement. And honestly, we have not created the anger that needs to happen. And that it's everybody on this call have not created, and we have not mobilized the world, let alone our own constituency, which is older persons themselves.
I am expressing this anger, Jack. As you may remember, I was a protagonist on the very first open-ended working group.
I remember that very vividly.
I insisted again and again. We in Brazil lost totally the protagonism because the previous government could not even hear the word human rights, let alone combine with other people. It's more than time for us to start kicking, to start shouting, and to say, before I am old, too old. I have aged over the last 13 years, and I don't want to wait another 13 years to have my rights respected. But it's not me who needs it. What we really need is when you hear Pax describing the situation in Malawi, when we hear developed countries describing what has happened to their institutions, enough is enough.
Enough is enough.
And we need to pressure. Fortunately, we have now, and I have to be political here, we have now a new government. We have a president that is committed. We have a Minister of Human Rights who has gone to Geneva to deliver this message at the Human Rights Council. And we have a new Secretary for Rights of Older People who is present there at the open-ended. Unfortunately, your country, Jack, is so discriminating. We from the South, I'm just stating this.
I'm not arguing.
It's not you, but it is the government. I have not been issued a visa to enter. It is unfortunate that United Nations is based in New York because they depend on your government to give us permission, something that is given for granted to those from the developed world.
You are absolutely correct, Alex. So you are going to be amongst those people who are going to not so much advocate, but to anger. So we have a lot of great comments in here, but Pax, what is your call to action?
Thank you, Jack. My call to action, especially in Malawi, as you know that Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yes, we know that.
And we don't have these nursing homes, for elderlies. I think what we are looking at as especially like Life Care, which is like a pioneer institution that started this type of training. We need to train more people in our country so that they should be able to understand and able to treat other people, especially the older persons. So we need more training for our people. And also we need also to establish kind of like the institutions in which those institutions should be taking some examples from the developed countries that are practicing at least caring for old persons. And like life care in Malawi, since it is just the only institution and the first institution establishing the caregiving trainings, we would like to
thank
get
you.
some other maybe
Pax,
partnerships and
I
other
wanted to move on
institutions to help us in developing.
Pax, I would like to
What's
move on
that?
to Dave, who's had his hands up for a while.
All right.
Sorry, Pax. I would just want to put one caution. I'm all for getting people riled up, Jack, but as someone who is on the business side of things in care in America, in the US, I watched how we went from being heroes to being vilified very, very quickly. I watched how people working in care were working 100 hours a week for over a year, who were risking their lives. The first person that I know that died of COVID was a 27-year-old nurse that I'd worked with for years, who ran ultra marathons and dropped dead in the facility. We have people who were doing the right things. Now, yes, there are bad actors. And I think that we need to develop a sense of urgency about the compassion that's needed. But anger always gets me a little bit worried, because the thing that we need to be angry at isn't the companies that are working within the system, it's the system itself. It's the fact that we still have a system in the US, and I'm focusing on that. But in the US, we have a system that is about maximizing profit from physical structures. It is about creating efficiency, which it doesn't. But we need to move away from that and focus back on the individual and care in a community setting, because that's always going to be better for people.
Thank you very much. On that note, we've gone well over time, and I apologize for that. However, I'm hoping that people will have found this energizing and even, Dave, angering. Thank you very much to all of the panelists who've given spectacular presentations. I would appreciate that we get your presentations individually to us so that we may be able to compile them or do something with them, because there's a lot of fantastic discussion, fantastic thought processes, and maybe there's the opportunity for progress. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Jack, and everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good,
Bye-bye.
good we did together.
Yes, it was a wonderful, wonderful meeting.
Let's hope it's productive.
Yes, that's right. Bye. Let's keep in touch. That's important.
The idea. That's obvious.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pax.
Welcome.
Thank you. Gracias.